My name's Glyn Pooley, and I'd like to talk about art. This time, my subject is Andy Warhol, as you can see, 1928 to 1987. Again, not a particularly long-lived life, but a very, very productive one. Many levels. He was pretty much a workaholic, I think they would say, and you'll see by the diversity of the work that he created. So there's a picture of him in front of one of his famous creations of Marilyn there. He was born in Pittsburgh in 1928. He was the son of first-generation Slovak immigrants. So he was there was deeply embedded this extreme work ethic, which is manifest in what he produces. But being first-generation immigrants as well, I think it enabled him to see America almost slightly from the outside, but with very clear vision. So, as we've seen with a number of these artists, early in his life as a child, he was quite sickly. He had a few illnesses, but during those convalescent periods, that was when art was encouraged for him again. His mum always encouraged him right the way through, as did some of his elder brothers. And as you say, found himself in Pittsburgh, which as a place really did not support the visual arts. So he moved to New York, which was the center of the scene there in America, in his 20s. But he went as a commercial artist. But let's have a look at some of his early drawings. So he always had a natural ability to draw, and he was able to also caricature and add a humorous slant to his work. That's the gun with bang there. But that was the route. So when he went to New York, he got the job as like an illustrator in some of the magazines, larger magazines, and because he could produce what the editors wanted very quickly, he did it exceptionally well. So well that by 1956, as a commercial illustrator, he was earning over £150,000 a year, which in 1956 was an incredible amount. So he did have this innate ability to generate incredible amounts of wealth. Although, from information given by people he worked with, they always said that he was never satisfied with the amount of wealth, and he was always anxious about having more, which is one of the characteristics that he kind of brings out in his art. He also becomes a mirror of American society because of this sense of drive and the reasons for this drive as well. And he illustrates it when he moves from his commercial artwork into his fine art. So it's an early project that he constructed. 25 cats named Sam and one blue pussy. Now this is the cover of the book. This was a series of lithographs he put together with his mum. In the flat that he was living in, they had over 20 cats, and they were obviously, he was trying to characterize their different personalities. But what he did was he asked the people around him to color the cats in. So he made the drawings, the lithographs. It was privately printed. I think he printed about 200, 195, something like that. He asked his mum to do the calligraphy. Hence, she forgot to put the D on name. So Slovakian maybe. So it's 25 cats named Sam rather than named. And so they were all kind of brought together collectively to create this book. It was made in the 50s, 54, but he reissued it in the 1980s as well. A couple of the early characteristics of his work, of course, were creating a series of artworks, because at the time, mass production in America had really kind of hit a peak, and he wanted to use commercial processes to create his art. So some of his early influences, and most Americans at that particular time in the culture, was Hollywood and the idea of this American dream, this idea that was coming from literally the silver screen of a world where if you worked hard, you could be very successful in life. So one of the icons, of course, this time was Elvis Presley, who was an incredibly famous singer, as we all know, but he also made a few films as well. So Elvis Presley was a person that changed music in America in terms of making it more accessible, particularly to a younger audience. And that also made it incredibly commercial and made lots of money. So what Andy did was take these images, he took a specific image from a film or sometimes a magazine, and he made it into a kind of icon. And the icon emerged out of repetition. Now, part of the theme, which also runs through his work, is that he was coming out of quite an orthodox Catholic tradition, about what they call a Byzantine Catholic tradition, where things like icons, of course, would have been very familiar to him and to the family. Most of his adult life, he tried to push away the religious aspect of his work. And, in a way, that's, of course, a reflection of how America progressed during this period. But we'll see towards the end that it revisited it. But it's important in terms of this sense of an icon being created, which was already embedded in certain parts of American culture, so they could be receptive. So by showing these things over and over and over, their glamour and their desirability got more and more heightened. But when we look at a number of Warhol's works, we see we're first taken by beautiful colours, and sometimes, with the icons, some beautiful people, but he always gives it a twist. These series pictures, as you can see, they disappear into black and white. Okay, they're like as if the color is slowly saturated out of them. Now, this is part of this. The method he used was silkscreen printing, and as you print more and more images from the silkscreen, the colors fade out. But he used this as a kind of device, as a comment, of course, on the nature of fame. Now, he famously said everyone could be famous for 15 minutes, even his cats. And that was a kind of movement which modern America at this time was embracing. So it was linking that with, of course, this immense force of consumerism and materialism, and he used this for his source material. So another icon, of course, was Marilyn Monroe, as I've written on the top there. This image was taken from a film, Niagara, but he made this picture, he was moved to make this picture about a month after she passed away. So again, this beautiful icon, rich kind of example of American culture, which was being through the silver screen and through movies and posters, etc., shared around the world, quickly faded away. And that cyclical quality repeats itself and repeats itself. He also was indicating, of course, by the reiteration of these images, that there's a process at work here. You do it again and again and again and again until you can't do it anymore. This is the part of the cycle that he was kind of working with. And it's interesting that he was sharing this back to the American people at the time, who of course were getting wrapped up into this and were really embracing the opportunity with a little bit more money they had in the 60s to buy all kinds of consumer goods. That he was kind of saying to them, or suggesting to them, that yes, if you take all this on and you keep buying these goods, etc., etc., be mindful, because you're going to go through a process that it will be there for a short period and then it will move away. It was interesting at the time, the consumers were most of them were just taking it on the level of they could just have more and more and more. As his career progressed, he mirrors the consequence of that action. So he's famous for, these series of consumables, which was a kind of first for that culture again as well. If you think, just going back a few years before the 60s, all soup would have been made handmade. You'd have to grow your vegetables, maybe cut them all up, and then you would be eating from fresh vegetables, etc. The idea that it could be put in a tin and then literally commodified was something new for the time. And the seductive part of it, of course, was possibly it could save time. While people's lives were starting to speed up, and for some, it was freeing some time up, because you could buy your dinner in a tin. He was also saying, yes, that's possible now, but also beware that there's going to be consequences along the lines. So it's condensed, it's not Campbell. It is Campbell's condensed soup, but it's not saying this is hearty or this is good for you or anything like that. So these images were shown all the time in that popular culture. Advertising was relatively new in this kind of way. So that was going out like never before. People were seeing it on this new medium as well, television, as well as the films, as well as the hoardings and the magazines. So they were starting to get almost bombarded by it. You could say like conditioned into this process of living, processed themselves to take on processed foods. And he kind of uses this as a motif. This is another example for 3D, almost like a ready-made that the early surrealists might have used. But these Brillo pads, which would make cleaning easier and quicker, they were everywhere. So they also shined things aluminium fast. The color aluminium, silver, was something which Andy Warhol went back to over and over. He used it in his silk screens, he used it in his exhibition spaces. But for him, again, it was linked up with pieces of silver which go back to biblical sources and, a betrayal of people. So it's always got this kind of double meaning. People coming to his work new obviously think that it is celebrating consumerism. And he was often criticized because he made so much money from it as well. He developed something called the factory, where he brought all these people together, and they would kind of make artworks collaboratively. But you can see in the 60s, this is the counter aspect. This is part of his Death and Disaster series. So there's been, one of the things, he was always trying to run away from a sense of death. And he was running into it through this kind of fame and fortune kind of path. And he had all these glamorous people around him in the factory. And they would go to the nightclubs in New York and things like that. But that high, heady life, which became very drug-induced by the end of the 60s, had these consequences. So, for example, in the media, they would show these images of people in car crashes or plane crashes and things like that on the headlines, and he would take the headline image out of the key headline images out of their national papers and make these very large pieces from them. Now, this would be like 12, 14 foot high. And again, he would do a series. And then when they asked him, why is the right hand side of the canvas blank? He would just, he had this very deadpan, he developed this very deadpan kind of way of responding, where he said, well, now the painting is twice as big, so I'll get twice as much money for it. You know, wise thinking. And it happened for him. Some of his artworks started to go for tens of millions, and then they're up to hundreds of millions. And don't forget, these are series works as well. He also had this other side to him, of course, where, as well as the glamour and the fame, he was aware of the civil rights movement, and he did a number of artworks which were kind of reflections on this. So this is an image from Life magazine of a peace march that went on in Birmingham, Alabama, where the mayor, of course, set the dogs onto the peace protesters, or the people standing up for peace. Again, it was an image, front page on the national newspaper, and then he takes it and he repeats it and he blows it up big. One of the things he said, once an image is being repeated enough times, particularly if it's kind of something which people really don't want to see, it's a bit horrific, car crashes, etc. Once it's been repeated enough times, they switch off or they desensitize themselves from it. So he was critiquing the fact of the way these images are being used and the way they're being read. But it's interesting to see how he's carefully selected images from the mass media that were being received in a certain way to inform and direct the public, and then he does the same. He takes the same image. He uses it in a subversive way. But during his lifetime, during the interviews, of course, he doesn't overtly say that. Okay, obviously because the society around him at the time gave him a tremendous amount of. There was a tremendous backlash. There was a backlash anyway. In '64, of course, the American political landscape changed quite drastically. Leading up to the '60s, they'd gone through, quite a difficult period. During the '50s, that kind of you had the McCarthy years and things like that, and it was communist emphasis, etc. Right, get rid of communism and all this kind of thing. They kind of put this battle between the left and the right, the forces of capitalism and communal work, communism. And then in 1964, or 63 or 64, I think it was 63, Kennedy gets shot in Texas, Houston, I think it's Dallas, Texas, and the headlines that came filled all the papers. They were everywhere. So now a couple of reasons. One is she was perceived as very glamorous, and so that was the kind of carrot which took people into the situation. But he documents her at different stages from these headlines. You've got her while she's going to Dallas and she's quite joyous before anything happens, then just after something happens, and then when she's at the funeral as well. So he kind of uses her as an emotive force because she was the physical, as she was in the front line of the most physical impact of it that people could kind of relate to from a Madonna perspective. And again, this is a Catholic connection, again, something very deep and ingrained in that kind of feeling. It was also, a clear indication of a breakup of America, a breakup of a different movement again. And you start to see what happens there. in the next few years, because the emphasis then is one where they move towards this seesaw between showing themselves and their world as progressive and achieving things, but below the surface, deeper and deeper cracks. The country was getting more and more divided. The wealth distribution was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Andy Warhol was one that connected and had a group of people that were connected to the elite in America that could enable these artworks to be made as well as generate a lot of money. But he also, when he opened the factory, he brought all kinds of people into that, which we'll see was part of the undoing. This is an intriguing picture of a series that he made in 1967, which, believe it or not, it seems hard now, that the elite art buying market at the time, these were very large silk screens, were actually kind of quite pleased to put up on their walls and in their galleries. It seems almost like staggering to us. This was the actual electric chair in a New York prison where they executed the Rosenbergs. Now, some of you probably know of the Rosenbergs, some don't. In 1952, they were convicted for treason for selling some or giving some nuclear-related secrets to the Russians. It was largely seen as a kind of show trial in the worst sense, and they were both convicted to be executed. Their sons, for many, many years, challenged that, and right up until last year, it took that long before Ethel, the husband was Julius, the wife was Ethel. Ethel was cleared of having next to no connection to it, and definitely not giving over any secrets. And when the Russians were interviewed years later, they said Julius gave us nothing we didn't already know at all. So it was about this power struggle between the so-called communist and the capitalist models. So he makes his piece in red, of course, which becomes a symbol, of course, of communism and blood, etc. But yeah, the most startling thing is from eyewitness at the time, people buying these pictures, they saw them as pure decoration. So this kind of waking up of this elite group was going to take quite a lot of work, as it still goes on today. He's a prophet in these kinds of ways. So after this death and disaster kind of series that he's done, which is also running parallel to some of his brighter images, we could say, in the factory, he collaborated with a number of photographers and performance artists. He made a number of films, his own little silver screen, although I don't know if I'd recommend any of you watch them. You can try, but some of them pretty tedious, in terms of they go on a long time. And I think, for example, one was just poetry, inverted commas, spoken word film that went on for over 35 minutes. And it was just nothing more than words being spoken into the camera. But they were kind of subversive films. Although from eyewitness accounts, Andy Warhol thought that they were going to be big hits. I don't know if he was tongue-in-cheek there. He thought he was actually going to be a Hollywood filmmaker making these things, but no, they're far too arty and subversive than that. But one of the groups that he was introduced to that came to be part of the factory was the Velvet Underground. Actually, this is where the Welsh get in, because there's one of the members of the Velvet Underground is John Cale, and when he was performing over there with them, of course, the lead singer was Lou Reed, and they were a kind of real motley crew. The Velvet Underground was, of course, a kind of dark movement. They sing a lot about drugs and loss and longing and things like that, which were in keeping with the factory at that particular time. The other side to Andy Warhol as well was that he was a gay man, and of course this was illegal. And this album cover, of course, is a definite nod to the gay scene, if you like. He did a series of pictures of drag queens as well, and he also was trying to raise awareness of the diversity of a scene that was also a rich seam in American society. Let's put it like that. Okay. So a little bit of a lighter image after those slightly dark ones. This series working up to 1970, taken from these photos. It says they're Flowers by Patricia Caulfield. She was the editor of Modern Photography, and he made a tremendous amount of images of these flowers. They were put together as some were like 48 inches by 48 inches, some were 24 by 24, and others were in smaller sections. But they were repeated and repeated and repeated with just variations of color till they became really kind of abstract. He took her image and he slightly twisted one of the flowers so that they could be viewed rotated through 360 degrees. So they were basically a piece of abstract art. The original photograph was just an image taken of some living flowers on the grass, which was advertising a Kodak home developing kit, which enabled you to manipulate color. So he's taking something which was of a mass product or indicating a mass product that people would engage with, and he's sort of turning it on his head and making an artwork of it through a silkscreen process and making images that, as I said, they were 48 by 48 and some were massive again, 10 or 12 feet by 10 or 12 feet, maybe even bigger. And some of these would sell for $1 million ago as well. So if you ever want to paint a flower picture, go for it like this. Whether you get $1 million, I don't know, but it's worth a try. It's intriguing. We're drawn by the colour, particularly if you look at the top one there, but we're also seeing the subversive element, the black and white element of the grass underneath, which is kind of the colours being taken out of it. So again, he plays with this seductive element, and then the seduction fades away. That kind of pattern goes on. And then you got this iconic image, which is one of the world's most reproduced images. It came from a photograph, as I've written there, by Alberto Corda, who was a Cuban photographer who took a picture of Che Guevara, a memorial service in 1960. And then one of Andy Warhol's colleagues and one of the people who worked or collaborated with him and made the factory work was a chap called Gerard Malanga, who was a photographer and a poet as well, and a musician. And he would oversee the production of these multiple pictures. But after the factory, his star faded a little bit, so he made this image out of his own bat. He just went off and took this image, took this way of working that Andy Warhol did, and he did his own version, and this was it. So of course, when Andy Warhol finds out what Andy Warhol did, he authenticated it. He said, "All right, it might be a forgery. Gerard Malanga might have made it, but I'm authenticating it." Which then, the art market, of course, it was worth hundreds of thousands again. So he was just trying to show what the art market and how it kind of operates and what truly interests it. It's also ironic because it's Che Guevara, a communist leader of a country that America have had an embargo on with since, 58, is it? Something like that. Anyway, a long, long time. So it almost makes a mockery of these different kind of extreme political movements as well. So this image, as we said, is kind of being reproduced more than nearly every other image. It's a revolutionary leader. Che Guevara was a doctor, of course, and leader of the revolution. And he kind of plays with this idea that once it's been repeated enough and enough and enough, more and more and more, it starts to become glamorized. It starts to become commodified, and it can be sold. And this image has appeared everywhere. T-shirts, mugs, badges, you name it. It's all over the place. This was a portrait he made of himself at this time as well. We should say 1968. I think it was about 1967 or 68 when in the studio, in the factory, as I said, he had all kinds of people around him, and they estimated in 1967 that I alluded to drug use in America, which had an impact on his art. That's why I mentioned it. And the drug use got to such an extent that it went from what they call more softer drugs, weed and things like that, to the use of speed and cocaine. And they estimated in 1967, at least 31 million people in America were using speed. Now, what this did, it kind of unmoored people, literally. They were having all kinds of strange trips. So they were in this heady atmosphere of the factory. And then one time, this woman, extreme feminist, who'd written a book called The Savage, which was all about death to all men, etc., went into the factory, and she literally shot him. She took it upon herself, shot him to try and kill him. Obviously, she was totally unmoored, and it was such a situation whereby most people would have died. But Andy Warhol had, of course, he was in New York, and there was this massive medical kind of force that went around him, and the doctors managed to rebuild him, basically, because nearly everything apart from his heart was shot up. So they rebuilt him, and he kind of survived. So he managed to survive for another 17, 18 years, which is totally incredible. But after that moment, it really affected his art, in the kind of production that he made. Now, the eyewitnesses at the time said while he was making art in the factory with these different collaborators, or these, photographers, dancers, drag queens, all this kind of thing, they perceived their relationship with him as he was their friend. But in reality, they said that he didn't really treat them like that. So he treated them like as if they were commodities. They were like tubes of paint or canvases. I mean by that, so an example would be he would pay a model $50, whole series, and then of course he would sell that, saying he'd take an image of them, silkscreen it, and then he would sell it for $500,000, over and over and over. So this kind of happened quite a lot. And that, of course, built up this element of resentment, and this fact that this man could do it and behave like this in those circumstances. Hence, that's what led to his death. So when he survives, he wants to kind of portray himself as this thoughtful, pensive kind of person, and his whole persona changes. All his interviews after that are very different. He becomes very quietly spoken, very introverted. And you see it in this reflection of this image here. He's there, and it's partly he's not there. The colours are subdued. He's thoughtful. He's looking straight at us, but now he's questioning us in a different kind of way. And then, full of surprises, in the early 70s, he was asked to make a series of paintings of the most famous person at the time, and people were suggesting Albert Einstein, and he said, well, actually, the most famous person is Chairman Mao, because in Chairman Mao, his image has been reproduced millions and millions of times in Mao's little red book. The Chinese, of course, were forced to read this under the Cultural Revolution, and what happened was in 1970, I think it was about 72, Nixon went over to meet Chairman Mao. Obviously, for political reasons, in terms of trying to raise his own profile. Also, there was trading issues, things going on there, no doubt. But after what had happened, leading up in the 50s and 60s and all that, McCarthyism, etc., and the communists were bad, and etc., etc., here he was now, Nixon, going off to the Chinese and, shaking their hands and being part of connecting with their system. And what Andy Warhol did, he made artworks of Chairman Mao on a scale like you wouldn't believe. They're like 2-story buildings, some of these. They're like 20 foot high, which is the sort of image you would get in Tiananmen Square, where you just say the big photograph of Mao. And then he brought that back to the American people and he commodified it. He showed it over and over and over. As I said, there's 199 artworks in 5 series, and they were reproduced. He kind of slightly made it again in a subversive way. He kind of glamorized, I don't know if that's the right word for Chairman Mao, but he kind of put lipstick on him and things like that, and commodified him in that way. Made him colourful and dark and almost like what we today we'd like airbrushed, but he represented it over and over and over again, so that it became part of the capitalist system. So you have an icon of communism now being an icon or a route or vehicle for the capitalist system. Intriguing theories of blending and awareness and connection and ways of looking at how systems work and how fragile systems are and how false they are as well. They're usually man-made creations to subdue certain levels of the population, whether it be extreme capitalism or whether it be extreme communism. And he's kind of blended those two. He's heightened them. He's mocked them by putting lipstick on Chairman Mao's lips, and he's then represented it to the American people. Of course, at the time, they would kind of not openly be able to express these views about the work he was doing. So he, in his interviews, as I said, he took on this state of being really quiet and make slight jokes and just not give any information personally away. But his artwork, of course, as time has gone on, it's become clearer and clearer what he was trying to show. This is a more light-hearted one. This was commissioned by one of the galleries, owner's wife, to make a series of animals. She said he'd made some images of animals in the 50s, the family cats, and he made one of the dachshund. He also had a dachshund as well. So it just goes to show that anything can be open to this process. So now we've got a famous image of a famous dachshund. You show it enough, you Andy Warhol it, you make it iconic like this, and then people go out and buy it in the thousands and thousands, and the commissions kept flooded in and flooded in. It's got a certain look, hasn't it? It's got a certain style. It's got this certain kind of feeling that we can see. The mechanical process of silkscreen enables you to use photographic images, often black and white photographic images, and then put layers of ink over the top, one layer on top of another to build it up. And then it can be relatively easy, reproduce, and reproduce. Hence the process. 2 more icons, of course, of the time. Muhammad Ali, Elizabeth Taylor. Muhammad Ali, famous for his transformation again, from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. Different cultural representations and combinations there as well. Elizabeth Taylor, of course, the siren of the silver screen. By appropriating very famous people and icons that were already in the consciousness of the country, it was an easier sell. There was a familiarity to him, so people were they'd already in some way or form welcomed those people into their house through the medium of the TV or to the film. So it was only just another step for them then to welcome these people into their house with an arts, with a silk screen or with a painting. People are familiar with it, so they've already brought their perception of an experience of that particular person with them when they see your particular artwork. So it's a very clever way of using popular culture to reach a larger audience. This one is an oxidization painting, which uses very unusual materials, wet copper paint, as you can see, and urination. Now, this was Andy Warhol, in a way, mocking the American abstract art movement, particularly Jackson Pollock, It's got a Pollock-esque kind of overall look there. So he would paint the surface with this copper paint, and then he would invite members of the factory and his friends and relatives to come in and pee over it. And then over time, it created these beautiful patterns. It grew into this beautiful pattern. So tongue-in-cheek representation of what high art was, particularly abstract art was. Don't forget, he had come from a commercial background as well. So again, the American public were always dubious of what high art was. And Jackson Pollock took tremendous ridicule, as did the other abstract expressionists, through from the American public. Of course, it didn't reach a lot of them. So he has just given his stance on that and slightly mocking them, as well as raising awareness of it, the process, raising awareness of abstract expressions in America as well. He uses organic processes, you could say, here that are constantly changing and transforming again. He's also using his themes of something starting off kind of glittery and glamorous, copper, then it puts something on it, urinate on it, and it will then disappear. It will disperse into something else, which maybe is not so pretty. So again, it's a process that he's working with. This is a whole one of a series of pictures that he created in the 80s. This is a picture of himself as a drag queen, and this is from a Polaroid image. He took lots of Polaroids of a number of quite famous drag queens in New York at the time, because they were like, the drag queens were the underclass, even in the gay community. They were always looked down upon, frowned upon. And there was this side, this you could call it a deep empathetic side to himself, where he wanted to show that, but he also wanted to bring out this idea that people play roles, the idea I put artifice and role play, and the ability to construct an identity, and hide behind an identity and a mask and things like that. We see that a lot with the arts. Also, he didn't entirely hide himself. You can still see that is Andy Warhol. He could have made himself up completely with so much makeup that you wouldn't realize it was him. But he did show that this was him as part and connecting with this community. And as I said, being a gay man and being involved with that particular time and scene, it was dangerous. That you always open up to attack, and as we said, he got shot, and it was a dangerous time. So he wanted to show that these other groups that were there and around, they were adding to the creative community, but in a way he also used them, as we said, and that led to difficulties. Some of these drag artists, they had very sad lives after being part of this scene for a little while, mainly because of the access to drugs and that kind of thing, again, and being marginalized in society. But again, he's showing a mirror to American society. He said, this is what goes on. This is what is happening. and I'm gonna show you large, in all your museums, which they fill with Andy Warhol stuff all over there in America, that and around the world, of course, but definitely in New York, that this is what's happening. This is what's around us as well. You've got to look at all the strata of your society and see the consequences of the actions that you're taking. This is, when you say you're taking the Mickey, well, that's a play on words for what he's trying to have a go at here. He's taking these silver screen icons again. It's hard sometimes for us to take ourselves back to these times, particularly the 1950s and 60s. But Mickey Mouse and that was a fun character that, was jokey. They created laughter, created humor, but an whole empire for young people of artifice was built out of it. Disneyland, Disney World. People spend millions and millions going to Disneyland, Paris, but down in America as well. So you're saying, yeah, it's a little animated still from a film, but all these other connections are part of it. The house of cards that can fall at any moment is built on these kinds of things. And again, he's just trying to show that these things can move through quickly, because he doesn't show a permanent image of Mickey Mouse. Still, he shows it animated. It's moving from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, and then it slowly fades away. I think, Mickey Mouse was absolutely massive, even in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Still is pretty big, but it has pretty much faded away for most on the scale that it used to be. So, he's just showing this is part of the process. And then this is a series of getting another commissioned portrait, quite large silkscreen portraits, 10 famous Jews of the 20th century. Albert Einstein's there. I can see Groucho Marx is there as well. And, these people, movers and shakers in America, but they were also become part of the elite. The media in America was largely run by the Jewish. There was a massive Jewish influence there. They were commissioning these works. They were running these galleries as well. They had a tremendous influence through popular culture and, of course, through economic levers of power in America. So, on the one level, he's just taken them purely as a commission to do and follow through, but he represents them as large icons. And he very astutely doesn't, if you like, explain overtly what he's doing at the time in presenting these kind of images of these Jewish people in this particular way. But what you can see, they often stare out at you. They have got there's colour in it, of course, but it's a certain kind of saturated colour. But there's also a dark side to it, and that was obviously a reflection of what else was going on and had gone on in more recent times as well. So again, multiple reasons are open to it. And then he was commissioned to do this series of endangered species. As you saw, he revisited the animal motif throughout his life. And these were made, of course, to raise awareness of the delicacy of the world ecology. And they were made and sold in vast numbers, raised lots of funds, and drew awareness to these incredible animals which were on the verge of extinction. Some are coming back a little bit now, but others are still very much in danger and a threatened to this day. So he was like an antenna that picked up on anything that was around him in terms of potential movements. And this movement really to save these animals and look after the the world and care for the world is an ongoing one, as we know to this day, that kind of goes up and down, and the forces grow in it. But he's doing it in amongst this culture of extreme capitalism and commercialism, which is the cause of the extinction of these animals as well, to a large extent. So again, it's a awareness raising process. And his empathy with the underdog and from different parts, different cultures, in a way, is shown here, where he collaborates with the famous young artist Basquiat, who was a graffiti artist. Some of you might know. He started off doing a graffiti in the underground in New York, and then he kind of went into the galleries, took him on, and they were kind of political statements, really. So here you've got a pretty much political statement. He's combining General Electric, one of the biggest capitalist companies in America, with this black waiter who is holding up this bottle of gin. It wasn't that long ago before this, of course, it was a segregated America, and black people weren't allowed to go into lots of places, etc. And the reference, slightly jokingly, says steep incline on the left-hand side to a sense of equality and diversity, people coming together. So again, it's like a little modern day Banksy in a way. So he had that arm to his work as well. He really connected with John Lennon, of course, who another icon that was fortunately taken in New York. Dangerous country, that America. You've got to be careful, I think. But he, again, appropriated this image, and it's iconic. It's iconic. It kind of way into lots of people's hearts and minds. So he would reproduce it on vast numbers and raise awareness, and also make lots of money, but also represent the cause of John Lennon, which, of course, John Lennon moved towards trying to raise awareness of peace and connection. And we know the story of John Lennon. So we iconified him again and represented him in that way. And then we got a Rorschach painting. These were large artworks that were encouraging the people who went to visit the galleries to get lost in them, basically. These were psychological images that they were created, they called a blot test, and they were designed to show up different levels of psychological state in the viewer by the psychologist Rorschach. So he made them on a really large scale, so that they kind of all consumed the viewer, and presented them as kind of a decorative image that would wrap itself around them and leave the viewer then to make up their own decision of how they felt or what kind of feelings it brought up in them as they were in that gallery environment. So it wasn't psychoanalysis in that way, it was the viewer relating to this great big object and them doing their own psychoanalysis on themselves, being in front of the piece, which is something which America became particularly fond of. The number of psychiatrists in America is probably through the roof. And it definitely reached a peak in the 80s and 90s, 2000s. Obviously, you couldn't move for a psychiatrist there, and they promoted the idea of a psychiatrist. And it was also wrapped up in, as we were saying, into the drug element. And Andy Warhol is mirroring this, or again, he does. I think he paints a pretty dark picture of America in hindsight, overall. Some kind of warning image about it. And it's interesting because when you first step into his work, you don't really think that that's maybe what he was all about. But this is another one of the Reigning Queens of 1985. Obviously, this is linked to glamour. It's also linked to power and linked to Queens, as in a part of New York, as in a part of the gay scene. And he's made them all look rather gay, I think you could say. And when we think of Queen Elizabeth, she was not really, particularly later on in her life, she didn't come across as particularly gay in her kind of public performances. She went rather to her lover. She did a grand job, but couldn't imagine her later on dancing around to disco divas or anything like that. But this idea of queens and rulers, and the iconic women, strong women in this case, was another thing which was part of his oeuvre. That he was very close to his mother, even when he was very ill and she was very old and getting quite elderly. He invited her to come and live with him in his New York apartment, and she stayed there right to the end of her life. Till nearly the end, where she went back to Pittsburgh and closer to his brothers. But she was always, very close. He was always very close to her, and empathy and understanding. And so the idea of a strong and powerful ruler, female ruler, was again something which he was championing in a way. But he's made them almost look like stamps, heads of states you put on letters, multiple, and see them all the time. They're either on the stamp or they're on the money, literally on the money. And this is getting towards the end now. This is a year before he died, and right the way through, as you said about the Catholicism and the spiritual element, and the life of Jesus in this case, and what happened, and the silver and the pieces and all that kind of thing. He was commissioned to do these large works for place in Milan. A number of artists were asked, but only he followed it through. And these were massive, massive pieces. Some were, this is taken the famous Last Supper scene, which is in a church there in Milan. And some of them he camouflaged, he used camouflage, like army camouflage, to put over their surface, just for this sense of what is the reading of religion again. How hidden is it? What are the layers of it? What does it mean to a culture? And again, this one, as well as the bright colours that he's overlaid it with, which draw you in, there's the darkness of the black and white image underneath, this is all about, betrayal, isn't it? And I think that's probably the theme of Andy Warhol's major themes of his work, being betrayed by the seductive process of, a sense of, capitalist system, or at least any extreme system, shall we say. Beware, and there's always a price to pay for it. It's interesting that he was a workaholic, and he was always afraid. They said that he was just trying to chase away death, And on his last picture, this is some of the last big pieces that he made. He looks scared to death, literally. Doesn't he? Love him. His wig is all over the place. Is up there, like as if he's got electric shock running through him. And the colour looks pretty, it's not glamorous, shall we say. So he was very honest with himself. And in his last years, he went and worked at a church homeless centre in New York for a while, serving the homeless in New York. And from the eyewitnesses, they said, there was no publicity stunt or anything like that. It was just a genuine thing that Andy wanted to give back and interact with people in that way. And he asked us if he could give out the coffees to everyone so he could have conversations with them. And he never made any kind of imagery of them or anything like that. He just went back to that act of charity and giving. So that was the kind of path that it led him to. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell notification.